The terminal at LAX buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Announcements echoing overhead, passengers jostling to board, and the rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases blending into a symphony of travel. David Williams adjusted his tailored navy blazer, glancing at his wife, Angela, who was soothing their youngest child, Ella, barely 5 years old. Next to her stood Michael, their 10-year-old, clutching his tablet, but keeping an eye on his father. Boarding should begin in a few minutes, David reassured, holding up their first-class tickets. The family was embarking on a long-overdue vacation to Maui, a rare moment of respite from David's relentless schedule as CEO of one of the country's most prominent airlines. This trip was supposed to mark a milestone: balance, family, and celebration after months of grueling negotiations. But fate had other plans. When the gate agent announced priority boarding, David gestured for his family to follow him. They walked towards the queue marked first class, where a dozen sharply dressed passengers were already lining up. Just as they approached, Captain John Carmichael appeared, a man with a weathered face, a crisp uniform, and an unmistakable air of authority. "Excuse me," John interrupted brusquely, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. He pointed at David's family. "This line is for first-class passengers only." David stopped, stunned for a moment by the sheer directness of the remark. Angela instinctively stepped closer to Ella, who tightened her grip on her mother's hand. "We are first-class passengers," David replied, his tone calm but firm. He held up their boarding passes, each clearly marked with the words first class. John barely glanced at the tickets before shaking his head. "I don't think so. This line is reserved for customers who paid for premium service. You'll need to step aside." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Other passengers began to notice the exchange, their curiosity turning into quiet murmurs. Angela's brows furrowed. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," John said, crossing his arms. "I'm stating a fact. People try this all the time, trying to sneak into first class when they don't belong." David inhaled sharply, his composure wavering. He was no stranger to subtle prejudices, but rarely had he encountered one so blatant, so unapologetically public. "Listen," David began, keeping his voice measured despite the growing heat in his chest. "My wife and I bought these tickets months ago. We're not sneaking anywhere. Now, if you'd like to verify with the gate agent, go ahead." John's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed he might back down, but instead he stepped forward, addressing the growing audience rather than the family. "Everyone thinks they're entitled these days," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We've got rules for a reason, and I'll make sure they're followed." Angela's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger. Michael, now fully aware of the tension, whispered, "Dad, why is he being mean?" David placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "It's okay, buddy. Let me handle this." By now, the murmurs had grown into audible protests. "This is ridiculous," an older woman in the queue said, glaring at John. "They clearly have first-class tickets. Let them board." "Yeah, what's the holdup?" another man chimed in. John turned to the gate agent, his voice clipped. "I need verification on these tickets." The young gate agent, caught in an impossible situation, hesitated before scanning the tickets. Her scanner beeped approvingly for each one. "These are valid first-class boarding passes," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. David raised an eyebrow at John. Satisfied? But instead of an apology, John doubled down. "Fine, but don't expect special treatment up there," he said, gesturing dismissively. David's temper finally slipped. "Special treatment? We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for basic respect." His voice was steady, but the tension in his words was unmistakable. Angela tugged his arm gently. "David, let's just go." He nodded, suppressing the urge to say more. As they walked down the jet bridge, whispers followed them. "Unbelievable," Angela muttered under her breath. Michael looked up at her. "Mom, why did he think we didn't belong?" Angela's heart sank. She crouched to meet his gaze, brushing a hand over his curls. "Sometimes people make assumptions about others without knowing them," she said carefully. "But it's not fair," Michael insisted. "You're right," David said from ahead, glancing back at his son. It's not fair. But what matters is how we choose to respond. They settled into their first-class seats, but the earlier warmth of excitement had been replaced by a cold unease. Angela busied herself unpacking snacks for the kids, while David stared out the window, lost in thought. Moments later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers and announcing the flight duration. When the plane reached cruising altitude, Angela leaned over. He's the captain, isn't he? David nodded grimly. Yes, Captain John Carmichael. Do you think he knows who you are? I doubt it, David replied. But he will soon enough. From his seat in the cockpit, John Carmichael felt a nagging discomfort. Something about the man's presence seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. Shrugging it off, he focused on the controls, oblivious to the storm brewing in the cabin and in his own future. As the flight attendants began service, several passengers leaned over to quietly express their support to David and Angela. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, one woman whispered. It was unacceptable. Thank you, David replied, offering a polite smile. But inside, he was already calculating his next move. This wasn't just a personal slight. It was a reflection of something much deeper. And David Williams wasn't the kind of man to let such things slide. By the time the flight landed in Maui, John Carmichael would realize just how wrong he had been. The aircraft touched down in Maui with a smooth glide, drawing scattered applause from the passengers. The momentary relief of arrival did little to erase the tension that had permeated the flight. David stood, unfastening his seatbelt as Michael eagerly peeked out the window. Angela busied herself packing up their belongings while Ella rested her head on her mother's shoulder, still groggy from the nap she'd taken mid-flight. As passengers disembarked, many exchanged polite smiles or murmured soft, "Excuse me, yes," while navigating the narrow aisle. But when Captain John Carmichael appeared at the front of the cabin to say goodbye, his face tightened as he spotted David's family among the last to leave. "Have a good stay," John said curtly, his tone as rigid as his posture. David stopped in front of him, fixing the captain with an unwavering stare. For a long moment, neither man spoke, the tension drawing the attention of the flight attendants lingering nearby. "You might want to take a closer look at your passengers next time, Captain," David said evenly, his voice carrying a weight that hinted at something more than casual advice. John's brow furrowed, but he remained silent, refusing to acknowledge the underlying meaning. David didn't wait for a reply. He ushered his family forward, his shoulders squared with an air of dignity that made John's skin prickle with unease. By the time the Williams family reached the baggage claim, David's phone buzzed incessantly. News traveled fast, and the social media storm had already begun. Passengers from the flight had posted tweets, Instagram stories, and even a TikTok recounting the incident at the gate. One particularly damning video showed Captain Carmichael's dismissive tone as he questioned the legitimacy of the family's first-class tickets. Angela scrolled through her own phone, her expression darkening. "David, this is blowing up," she said, turning the screen to show him a tweet with thousands of likes. "A family was humiliated by the captain of our flight simply for trying to board first class with valid tickets. Completely unacceptable. Hashtag prejudice and disgust." "Good," David muttered, though his tone betrayed little satisfaction. "It's about time people see what happens when we let prejudice go unchecked." Angela sighed, glancing at their children. "I just didn't want the trip to start like this. For the kids, you know?" David softened, placing a hand on her arm. "I know, but sometimes things like this happen for a reason. We'll make it right. For them and for everyone else who's been through something similar." Meanwhile, John Carmichael had retreated to the crew lounge, still fuming from the confrontation. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by passengers who seemed so determined to make a spectacle of themselves. He sat heavily in a chair, scrolling through his own phone. When he opened the company email, his stomach dropped. An internal memo had already been circulated, referencing an incident involving a high-profile passenger. Though no names were mentioned, the language was clear. This was serious. John scowled, tossing his phone onto the table. "High profile, my ass," he muttered under his breath. "Trouble already, Captain," One of the flight attendants, Megan, quipped as she entered the lounge. John shot her a look. "Don't start." Megan raised her hands in mock surrender, but didn't back down entirely. "You know, if you just treated people decently, you wouldn't find yourself in these situations." "I treated them fairly," John snapped. "They were acting entitled, and I called them out. End of story." Megan arched an eyebrow. "Fairly? Is that what you call it?" "Because from where I stood, it looked a lot like profiling." John glared at her, but Megan didn't flinch. "Look," she continued, "you might want to check who you're dealing with before digging your own grave. That man, David Williams, he's not just another passenger. He's the chairman of the board." The color drained from John's face. "What are you talking about?" Megan crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "David Williams. He's the reason we have half the luxury amenities in first class. He's the one who spearheaded the entire program. You've been flying under his policies for years." John's mind raced. Memories of corporate meetings and policy updates flashed through his thoughts. He had heard the name before, but had never connected it to the man he'd confronted at the gate. "Shit," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "Yeah," Megan said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Good luck explaining yourself when the execs get involved." At their hotel, the Williams family was greeted with champagne and leis, the staff going out of their way to make them feel welcomed after the ordeal. But the warmth of the greeting did little to erase the lingering tension from earlier. As David settled into the suite's plush sofa, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the CEO of the airline. "David, I just received word of what happened. Rest assured, this will be addressed immediately. I'll personally oversee the investigation into Captain Carmichael's behavior. Please let me know if there's anything else I can do to make this right." David read the email aloud to Angela, who shook her head. "Do you believe him?" David considered it. He's in damage control mode. "But this isn't about me. It's about the culture we've allowed to fester. I'll reply when I've decided what the next step is." "Do you think Carmichael knows who you are yet?" Angela asked. David smirked faintly. "If he didn't before, he does now." Back at the crew lounge, John couldn't sit still. Megan's words replayed in his mind, each one hammering home the gravity of his mistake. He knew his next flight would be scrutinized, his behavior dissected. And then there was David Williams. John clenched his fists. Why didn't he just say who he was? "Because he shouldn't have to," Megan shot back, re-entering the lounge with her bag. "Respect isn't reserved for people with titles, John. Maybe that's something you should think about." Her words stung, leaving John with an uncomfortable truth he wasn't ready to face. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping the fallout. This wasn't just another passenger complaint. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The boardroom was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. John Carmichael sat in one of the leather chairs, his hands clasped tightly on the polished wooden table. He wasn't used to being called into meetings like this, at least not for the wrong reasons. Across from him, David Williams sat in the seat of power, effortlessly composed. The board members flanked him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet disapproval. David had remained silent since the meeting began, letting the gravity of the situation settle like an unwelcome fog. "Captain Carmichael," began Sarah Mead, the company's chief legal officer, her tone clipped and professional. "I trust you understand why you're here today." John nodded, though the gesture felt heavy. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she continued, sliding a thin stack of papers across the table. "These are the reports from passengers on Flight 2487, as well as statements from crew members and video evidence circulated online. As you can see, the incident has escalated beyond a routine passenger complaint." John's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sarah adjusted her glasses and glanced at David. "Mr. Williams, would you like to add anything?" David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice, though calm, carried a sharpness that cut through the tension. "Captain Carmichael, do you know why we created the first-class program in the first place?" John hesitated, unsure if this was rhetorical. "To provide a premium experience for high-paying customers." David tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "That's part of it. But more importantly, it was to reflect the values this company stands for: excellence, respect, and inclusivity. A passenger's worth isn't measured by their appearance, their background, or even their seat assignment. It's measured by the trust they place in us to treat them with dignity. John's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. David continued, "What you did at that gate wasn't just an isolated act of bias. It was a public demonstration of everything we strive not to be." For the first time, John felt the weight of those words. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his defenses cracking. "I wasn't trying to disrespect anyone," John said, his voice quieter now. I made an assumption." "An assumption," David repeated, leaning back. "About a man traveling with his family. About a child holding his mother's hand. What exactly made you assume we didn't belong?" John struggled to find an answer. It wasn't the tickets," David interrupted, his voice still measured but firmer now. "Because they were valid. It wasn't our behavior, because we were polite. So, Captain Carmichael, what was it?" The room went silent, every pair of eyes fixed on John. "I don't know," John finally admitted, his voice barely audible. David let the silence stretch for a moment longer before speaking again. "That's the problem. You don't know." But the world sees the result. Later that day, as John left the building, the weight of the meeting bore down on him. His usual confidence felt hollow. The world outside hadn't stopped. Cars honked, people rushed past, and the city buzzed with its endless energy, but John felt disconnected, like he was moving in slow motion. He didn't go home immediately. Instead, he found himself at a nearby coffee shop, nursing a lukewarm latte and replaying the day's events in his mind. Megan's words from the crew lounge came back to him. Respect isn't reserved for people with titles. He thought about David Williams sitting across from him at that table, the quiet authority in his voice, the way he hadn't raised it once, but still managed to make John feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. And then he thought about the family, about the little boy who had asked why someone was being mean, about the mother's flushed cheeks, trying to shield her children from the humiliation she couldn't stop. John put his head in his hands. While John wrestled with his thoughts, David was busy with his own plans. He had spent the afternoon in meetings with the PR team, ensuring the company's response to the incident was swift and meaningful. But now, he was in the hotel suite with his family, the kids sprawled out on the couch watching cartoons while Angela sipped a glass of wine by the balcony. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, watching him type furiously on his laptop. "About what?" "Letting the company handle it internally. You could have called the press, taken control of the narrative yourself." David stopped typing and looked at her. "That's not what this is about. It's not about headlines or revenge. It's about making sure something like this doesn't happen again. Not just to us, but to anyone." Angela smiled faintly, setting her glass down. "You really believe he'll change?" David shrugged. "I don't know, but I know we have a responsibility to give him that chance. To give everyone that chance." The next morning, John arrived at the airline's headquarters for his mandated meeting with the company's diversity and inclusion officer. He wasn't looking forward to it, but he knew better than to argue. The session was grueling, filled with scenarios and discussions that forced him to confront the biases he'd spent years ignoring. "I'm not a bad person," he said at one point, frustration creeping into his voice. "No one's saying you are," the facilitator replied calmly. "But good intentions don't excuse harmful actions. This isn't about who you are. It's about how you treat others." By the end of the day, John felt drained, but also different. For the first time, he saw the incident for what it was, a failure on his part to live up to the very values his uniform represented. 2 weeks later, John stood at the gate of another flight, this time watching passengers board with a new perspective. When a young family approached the first-class line, he caught himself, his instinct to assess, to question, flickering for a brief moment before he consciously stopped it. "Welcome aboard," he said with a genuine smile, stepping aside to let them pass. David's words echoed in his mind. A passenger's worth isn't measured by their appearance. He was beginning to understand what that truly meant. The soft rustle of papers filled the conference room as board members passed around a preliminary draft of the company's new inclusion policy. David Williams sat at the head of the table, his expression thoughtful as he flipped through the document. This was the culmination of weeks of effort, not just to address the incident with Captain Carmichael, but to set a new standard for the airline's operations. We'll be rolling this out in phases, Sarah Mead explained, her voice steady. The first will focus on employee training, starting with the flight crews. Phase 2 will involve restructuring our customer service protocols, and the final phase includes public outreach campaigns to rebuild trust. David nodded. It's a start, but it needs to go deeper. Policies are only as good as the culture that supports them. A few board members exchanged glances. One of them, a senior executive named Greg Thompson, cleared his throat. David, we all agree the situation was regrettable, but let's not overcorrect. We don't want to alienate our more traditional customer base. David's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone cool but firm. Our traditional customer base isn't the issue, Greg. The issue is ensuring every passenger, every employee, feels valued. If we can't deliver on that, we fail. Not just as a company, but as people. The room went silent, the weight of his words settling over the table. Meanwhile, in a smaller training room on the ground floor, Captain John Carmichael was sitting through yet another workshop. This one was focused on identifying implicit bias, and it wasn't going any easier than the last. The facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Lisa, was leading a discussion about microaggressions. Sometimes bias shows up in the smallest ways, a comment, a gesture, even the way we look at someone. These actions might seem harmless to us, but they can reinforce stereotypes and marginalize others. John shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Lisa turned her attention to him. Captain Carmichael, would you be willing to share your experience? He froze, every eye in the room suddenly on him. I don't know what to say. Just speak honestly, Lisa encouraged. John took a deep breath. I made an assumption about a family boarding a flight. I thought they didn't belong in first class because... He trailed off, struggling to find the words. Because of how they looked? Lisa prompted gently. He nodded, shame flooding his face. Yes, and I was wrong. But at the time, I didn't even realize what I was doing. It was instinct, years of assumptions I didn't even know I was carrying. Lisa smiled faintly, acknowledging that is the first step. Bias isn't something we erase overnight. It's something we unlearn, piece by piece. And it starts by being willing to look at ourselves honestly, just like you're doing now. Later that day, David sat in his office, scrolling through the latest reports from the PR team. The incident with John Carmichael had gone viral in ways he hadn't anticipated. While some reactions were predictably divisive, many applauded the company's swift response and commitment to change. But there was one message that caught David's attention. It was an email from John himself, marked with the subject line, an apology and a thank you. David hesitated before opening it. Dear Mr. Williams, I owe you and your family a profound apology, not just for my actions at the gate, but for the mindset that led me to them. These past weeks have been humbling, to say the least. The workshops I've attended have opened my eyes to the biases I didn't even know I carried. For what it's worth, I'm committed to doing better, not just as a captain, but as a person. I also want to thank you. You had every right to demand my dismissal, to publicly drag my name through the mud. But instead, you chose to handle this with dignity and grace. That choice has given me a chance to change, and I don't take that lightly. Sincerely, Captain John Carmichael. David leaned back in his chair, the words sinking in. He wasn't sure how he felt. Relief, perhaps, or cautious optimism. But there was one thing he was certain of. Change, real change, was possible. As the weeks passed, the airline's new policies began taking shape. Training sessions became mandatory for all employees, from ground crew to senior management. Customer surveys were revamped to include questions about inclusivity and respect. And then there were the passengers. The story of the Williams family had resonated far beyond the airline industry, sparking conversations about bias in everyday interactions. Social media was flooded with stories from others who had faced similar treatment, each one a reminder of how much work remained to be done. One afternoon, as David walked through the terminal at JFK, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A family was approaching the first-class line, a father, mother, and 2 young children. They looked nervous, the father glancing repeatedly at their tickets as if bracing for a confrontation. But instead of being stopped, They were greeted warmly by the gate agent. "Welcome aboard," she said with a smile, stepping aside to let them through. David felt a flicker of hope. For John Carmichael, the journey was far from over. He still carried the weight of his mistakes, but he also carried a newfound determination to be better. One day, as he prepared for a flight, he spotted a young pilot standing nervously near the cockpit. She was clearly new, her uniform crisp but her hands fidgeting with her ID badge. "First day?" John asked, his tone kinder than it had been in years. She nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm a little nervous." John smiled, extending a hand. "Don't worry. You'll do great. Welcome to the team." It was a small gesture, but for John, it was a start. A start toward being the kind of leader and the kind of person he wanted to be. 3 months had passed since the infamous flight. The story of David Williams and Captain John Carmichael had evolved from a viral controversy into a case study for corporations grappling with issues of bias and inclusivity. The airline, now hailed as a model for reform, had fully implemented its new policies, and David's leadership had become a beacon for change within the industry. But for David, it wasn't about accolades or media praise. It was about making tangible progress. On a crisp autumn afternoon, David stood in front of an auditorium filled with airline employees, pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and executives. They had gathered for the company's annual summit, where David was set to deliver the keynote speech. Angela sat in the front row, flanked by Michael and Ella, both of whom had grown used to seeing their father in the spotlight. Michael, now more aware of the world around him, whispered, "Is he going to talk about what happened?" Angela smiled, brushing a hand through his hair. "Maybe, but mostly he'll talk about how we can all be better." David approached the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. The room fell silent as he began. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady but warm. 3 months ago, an incident occurred that none of us will forget. What began as a moment of frustration and humiliation for my family became a mirror, forcing us to confront hard truths about who we are as individuals, as a company, and as a society. He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've spent my career in this industry because I believe in the power of connection. Aviation isn't just about transporting people from point A to point B. It's about bridging distances, bringing cultures together, and reminding us that we're all part of something bigger. But that mission falters when we allow prejudice, bias, or indifference to seep into our work." A few heads nodded in agreement. David continued, his tone softening. "I want to share something personal. After that flight, my son asked me a question. Why did that man think we didn't belong? As a father, that question broke my heart. But as a leader, it became a call to action. Because the truth is, it wasn't just about one man or one moment. It was about the systems and mindsets that allow such assumptions to persist." In the back of the room, John Carmichael listened intently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. This was the first time he'd seen David since their meeting in the boardroom. Though he wasn't certain what to expect, he felt a mixture of apprehension and gratitude. David glanced around the room, his gaze meeting John's for a brief moment before moving on. "Change isn't easy," he said. "It requires courage, humility, and the willingness to admit when we're wrong. But I've seen what this company is capable of when we come together. I've seen the commitment in our employees, the support from our passengers, and the determination to turn a mistake into an opportunity for growth." The audience erupted into applause, but David wasn't finished. "Today, we're not celebrating an end. We're marking a beginning, a commitment to hold ourselves accountable, to listen, to learn, and to lead by example. Because every passenger, every employee, and every person we encounter deserves to feel seen, respected, and valued." As he stepped away from the podium, the applause grew louder, filling the room with a sense of hope and renewal. After the event, David mingled with employees, listening to their thoughts and answering questions. Eventually, he found himself face-to-face with John Carmichael. "Captain Carmichael," David said, extending a hand. John hesitated before shaking it, his grip firm but respectful. "Mr. Williams, I want to thank you again for how you handled everything. You could have ruined me, but instead, you gave me a chance to grow." David studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Everyone deserves a chance, Captain. What matters is what we do with it." John nodded. "I won't waste it. I promise." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the incident continued to spread. The airline's new policies were adopted by other companies, sparking industry-wide conversations about equity and inclusion. Training programs were expanded, not just to address bias, but to promote empathy and understanding. For David and Angela, life gradually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for a family at the center of a cultural reckoning. They took the kids on another trip, this time to the Grand Canyon, where Michael and Ella marveled at the sweeping vistas. On the final evening of the trip, as the family watched the sun set over the canyon, Michael turned to his father. "Dad, do you think that man, the pilot, really changed?" David thought for a moment before answering. "I think he's trying. And sometimes, trying is the most important step." Ella, nestled against Angela, yawned and asked sleepily, "Why do people have to change at all?" David chuckled softly, brushing a hand over her hair. "Because none of us are perfect, sweetie. But we can all be better." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Williams family sat together, their bond stronger than ever. And somewhere, thousands of feet in the air, Captain John Carmichael piloted another flight, his heart a little lighter, his perspective forever altered. For both men, the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.